The courtroom went silent as a 74-year-old man in full Marine Corps dress blues stepped through the doors, metals gleaming, spine straight, eyes like steel. The HOA called him a lunatic. But now, even the judge looked breathless. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Henry Caldwell got the first letter, he was kneeling in the dirt, his gnarled hands buried wrist-deep in the stubborn tangle of crabgrass choking his flower beds. A cold wind teased the edges of his old flannel shirt, but he didn't flinch. His body, riddled with shrapnel and arthritis, had long ago learned to ignore discomfort. What it hadn't learned was indifference. Not to duty, not to routine, not to the sharp dignity of doing what needed to be done, even if no one noticed. The envelope was white, heavy stock and official-looking, tucked tight in the brass mailbox he had polished every Saturday since 1987. He read it standing, squinting under the glare of the late-morning sun. The wording was precise, sterile, language designed to bruise without breaking skin. His lawn, it claimed, was detracting from the visual harmony of the community. The fine, $250. No signature, only the stamped logo of Elmwood Heights Homeowners Association, and the thin, perfumed scent of bureaucracy. Henry folded the letter once, crisply, and slid it into his back pocket. He didn't cry. He didn't mutter. Instead, he returned to his knees and resumed tugging weeds from the earth with slow, methodical precision, as if every root he unearthed might redeem an inch of ground, or a fragment of memory he refused to let rot under the weight of silence. Inside the homes around him, shades fluttered as people peeked out, then turned away. They knew who he was, or thought they did. The rigid man who wore his Marine Corps cap like armor and corrected grammar when children misspoke in the street. A living monument, maybe. Or just an inconvenient ghost haunting the neighborhood's clean new edges. The second letter came 7 days later. It didn't just escalate. It accused. Ongoing non-compliance, sanitation risks, unresolved behavioral concerns. This time, the HOA included a photograph, taken from the sidewalk, of his garage, where a rusted workbench and a stack of firewood leaned at angles less than picturesque. The accompanying fine doubled, and at the bottom, a final line. Chronic violations may result in formal complaint and removal of problematic residents. Problematic. Henry sat with that word longer than the rest. Not neighbor, not veteran, not even resident. Just a problem. And yet, he didn't tear the letter. He placed it beside the first in a worn wooden drawer, next to his discharge papers and the folded flag from his son's casket. Symbols, all of them. Of things the world had decided were no longer fashionable. But Henry Caldwell had learned long ago that you don't win wars by being fashionable. You win them by standing up when it's easier to sit down. And so, he stood. The week that followed the HOA's complaint felt less like a legal process and more like a siege. Quiet, methodical, relentless. Rumors, like rot, crept beneath the painted fences of Elmwood Heights. Henry Caldwell had shouted at the mailman, they said, dug trenches in his backyard, barked at children in a drill sergeant's tone. No one had seen it firsthand, of course. But that didn't matter. In a neighborhood obsessed with image, whispers were more dangerous than facts. Henry said nothing. Instead, he rose each day with the same discipline that had once roused battalions. At 0600 sharp, he pulled on his work gloves, strapped the brace tight around his left knee, and got to work. His hedge clippers sliced through overgrowth with surgical rhythm. He repainted the mailbox, scrubbed mildew from the siding. He didn't ask for help, but when a teenage boy named Caleb from 2 doors down offered to clear out the garage for $20, Henry handed him 40 without blinking. Inside, his dining table became a war room, Stacks of HOA bylaws, local zoning regulations, court procedures, and old military legal guides covered every inch. He read them with the same cold precision he once reserved for tactical briefs. It wasn't rage that moved him. It was resolve. His silence was not surrender. It was preparation. Then came the phone call. A voice from the past. Lieutenant Daniel Ruiz, now retired, formerly Judge Advocate General. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. Ruiz had heard about the case from a mutual contact and offered guidance. "File a counterclaim," he said. "Push back. Show them you're not a ghost. You're a soldier." And Henry did. By the time the court scheduled an in-person hearing, Tiffany Morgan was already celebrating in whispers. "Let the judge see who he really is," she reportedly told the board. "The crazy's bound to leak through." But when the courtroom doors opened that morning, it wasn't madness that entered. It was command. Henry Caldwell, 74 years old, walked with measured strength down the aisle, cane in one hand, bearing the weight of history in the other. His Marine Corps dress blues were pristine. Every button gleamed, each ribbon exact. His posture was straight, his eyes unflinching. The silence that filled the room wasn't awkward. It was reverent. He wasn't there to shout. He was there to remind them, and the nation, what it means to serve and not surrender. There was no jury, no grand speeches or television cameras, just a small municipal courtroom with beige walls, a humming fluorescent light, and 20 pairs of eyes watching a man most of them had misjudged. Henry Caldwell stood at the defendant's podium, his frame erect despite the years etched into his spine. He wore no armor but truth, no notes, no lawyer, only the weight of lived history and a voice carved from command. His dress blues, so immaculate they seemed to defy dust, caught the overhead light with every movement. But it wasn't the uniform that silenced the room. It was the presence. A kind of gravity that made even the fidgeters still. He began with facts. His tone was steady, his diction clipped but never cold. He outlined the timeline, the letters, the fines, the accusations. He named no one. He accused no one. He simply described. The kind of description that leaves little room for denial. Then came the personal. He spoke of his wife, Claire, how she'd died of pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, how she had loved their garden and arranged tulips by color. He mentioned his son, Daniel, killed by a drunk driver on leave from Fort Benning. No dramatics, just memory, spoken like ritual. There was a moment where his hand trembled as he reached for a photograph of the house, lawn cut, hedges neat, but he steadied it on the podium before anyone could rise to help. When he quoted the HOA bylaws, it wasn't to show off. It was to demonstrate how meticulously he had studied them, how even under attack, he chose knowledge over retaliation. He cited sections, quoted passages, displayed documentation, dates, signatures, photos with timestamps. He handed the judge a binder labeled in military font, Caldwell versus Elmwood Heights HOA. Judge Leonard Price, a former Navy corpsman turned civil servant, listened without interruption. He nodded only once, when Henry explained how the public disturbance claim stemmed from a neighbor mistaking the sound of a dropped rake for shouting. Then Henry looked up. "I didn't fight for this country so I could be harassed out of my home in peace," he said, voice low but resonant. "I didn't survive 2 tours in the jungle to be shamed by people who think patriotism is an eyesore." No one moved. No one dared. When Tiffany Morgan's attorney stood to raise concerns about mental stability, the judge cut in, his voice like a gavel before the blow. "Do you have psychiatric evaluations? Any formal diagnosis?" "No, Your Honor. Just complaints." "I have medals," Henry said. "They're not just decoration. They come with scars." And then Silence again, thick and reverent. When the judge asked if he had any final words, Henry said nothing. He simply turned toward the flag mounted behind the bench. And with perfect, deliberate precision, he raised his right hand to his temple and offered a salute. Not a gesture, a statement. The courtroom rose not by command, but by instinct. Not just to honor a veteran, but to correct their own failure to recognize him sooner. There was no parade, no triumphant speech or marching band, just a folded sheet of paper delivered by courier, crisp legal type confirming what the room had already known the moment Henry Caldwell raised his hand in salute. The court had ruled in his favor. Every count, every charge dismissed. The HOA fined for harassment, forced to retract its claims, and, in a small but significant clause, ordered to publish a written apology to Henry Caldwell, United States Marine Corps, retired, for undue distress, defamatory implication, and public defamation of character. The ink had barely dried when Tiffany Morgan tendered her resignation. Her letter cited personal stress and irreconcilable differences with the direction of the board. No one argued, but Henry didn't gloat. He didn't so much as allow himself a smile in public. He received the judgment with a nod and a quiet, "Thank you, Your Honor," before gathering his documents and walking out the same way he had entered, upright, unshaken, and without a single backward glance. That evening, just before sunset, Henry walked out to his front yard carrying the same folded flag he had raised every evening for decades. His pace was unhurried, almost ceremonial. With calloused fingers, he unfurled the fabric and secured it to the pole mounted beside his porch. The flag rose slowly, catching the last light of the day, its edges fluttering against the breeze. It had been part of his daily ritual for years, a moment no one noticed, or if they did, had dismissed. But this time something was different. Doors opened, curtains shifted. The Henderson boy, who once mocked him for talking to birds, stood barefoot on the curb and clapped. A woman from 3 houses down left a cherry pie on the porch with a note that simply read, "Semper Fi." Caleb, the teenager who helped clean Henry's garage, stood tall at the base of the flagpole and gave a stiff, sincere salute, crooked but earnest. He held it until Henry returned it, and across the city the story began to ripple. The veteran who took his stand aired that night on local news, a quiet 3-minute segment stitched together with courtroom footage and neighbor interviews. But it didn't stay local for long. Veterans organizations called. Emails flooded in. A city councilman issued a statement promising a review of HOA authority and abuse. It wasn't just Henry's story anymore. It was a warning and a reminder. Henry never chased the spotlight. When asked for interviews, he politely declined. "The work's done," he'd say. "No need to shout about it." But come Memorial Day, before dawn, Henry stood on his lawn again, flanked by neighbors in robes and children holding flags, by teenagers in hoodies and old men in worn caps. No one spoke. No one needed to. Together, they watched the stars and stripes rise in silence. And for once, silence didn't mean dismissal. It meant respect.